Uh, you know, as we do books like Micah, sometimes, we actually may not always know where Micah is. And then we are doing a whole bunch of Micah, and then we are trying to look at all the scriptures inside that and make sense of that. Uh, and one of the things that I love about what we do here is that we mix up topical series with complete books, whole books of the Bible. Does anyone want to tell me which of these books we've done before? Do you remember which of these books right here we've actually done before? Do you remember any of them? Daniel, Psalms, Jonah? Yes, yes. Good on you. That was like 3-4 years back, but you remember it. What else? Any other books that we've done from here? Ephesians, right? What else? Did we do Revelation? Okay, I don't remember. That must have been before my time. Acts, we did some Acts, yes. Did we do John? I remember we did Mark. We did Hosea, right? So, I was listening to a Bible scholar, somebody I look up to a lot, Dr. Chris Wright, and he was speaking about the will that what Paul the apostle feels is important for church growth. And he mentioned this particular verse in Acts 20:27, where it says, "For I have not hesitated to proclaim to you the whole will of God." The whole will. Not parts of it, not pieces of it, but the whole will of God. Right there, that's the whole will of God. It's the whole of scriptures. And part of the reason why it's so critical, is because the Bible is the story of God's redemption of the world. The Bible is a story. And we are part of that story. If we want to understand how to live as part of that story, then we need to know that story. Yeah. You need to know the whole of that story and all its nuances. So, and I loved one of the things that Dr. Chris said in that particular talk, and I was sharing this with the staff team. Why do we tend to become legalistic in our spiritual life sometimes? The reason is because we pick up the verses and the books in the Bible that we like, and we pick that up, one piece, we take it out of the context and paste it on our walls, and decide that that is the mantra by which we should live by, which is true, but it's only half the truth. And then we make those into our rules, and we end up with a whole lot of religion instead of a relationship, which is what God wants, And so, as we do this book, I'm so grateful that we're doing it. Let's be aware of the story that it is a part of. Does anyone have a physical Bible, by any chance? Anyone has a physical? Yes, thank you. Can you open it to the book of Micah in your Bible? Just open it to the book of Micah. And I'm just going to borrow it from you as you do that. Okay, thank you. You can do the same. Go ahead, Hannah. Do you see this? Do you see this? We are somewhere in the middle of the story. That's the point. So when you open the Bible and when you read it, that's why actually I do read a physical Bible for this reason, because it reminds me which part of the story I am in. And that reminds me that there was a beginning and there was an end, and there is an end. Thank you so much. And sorry, I'm walking all over the Bible. Just a few more quick questions for you all. Do you know the different genres of books that are here? Can anyone tell me? Or maybe what I'll do is, I will shout out the genres and you tell me which are the books that fall in those genres. What is the Pentateuch? All right, great. So for those of you, thank you for all of you who were enthusiastic. The first 5 books is the Pentateuch. What's the wisdom literature? Those who said somebody else, someone other than those who said. Why is it called that? Where is it in my notes? Yeah. The wisdom literature is basically poetry, right? And it actually tells it in poetic form. It basically gives us wisdom. What are the other genres? Sorry again? The Gospels, great. And that's all the way up there at the end, right? Which are the Gospels? Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. What else is there? Okay, the letters and the epistles. Can you give me a few examples? Good job, yeah. Basically, nobody understands what you're saying, but what they're saying is somewhere there, you have the letters that are written. Okay, what are the other genres? The prophetic books, all right, great. And what kind of prophetic books are there? What kind? Right, major prophets, minor prophets. Basically meaning major prophets are the ones you should listen to and the minor prophets kind of just like set aside. No, huh? Then? It's just long and short, that's all. Yeah, so the minor prophets actually were originally just one book. There were 12 minor prophets, which can fit in one scroll, and they were all in the original book that that Jesus read and the disciples read was just one book, and it was called the 12, right? And the major prophets are Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Lamentations, and Isaiah, right? 5 of them. I missed one. I'm trying to remember. Did I say Ezekiel? There are 5 anyway. It's right there. We missed one genre. Yeah, finally Pauline has to come and save you all, right? There you go. Yeah, the history books, right at the beginning, right in the middle. Whole bunch of stuff about the kings of Israel and all of that. And yeah, the Psalms are part of the wisdom literature, right? So which we great. Prophets, and Micah is what? Micah is a minor prophet. And it's in the the understanding of the genre that we are reading is important to understand how to interpret it. All right? Because not every book in the Bible is something that you can just read and say, oh, I'm going to apply this in my life the same way. Right? It takes a little bit of work to understand how to look at what we are reading. And one of the things that I mentioned was to understand which part of the story of the Bible we are in. I hope that helps. And coming back to prophets, can anyone tell me who are prophets and what they did? God's representatives speaking his word. Thank you, Pauline. And what kind of word did they speak? Were they fortune tellers who, isn't that an idea sometimes that we can have about the prophets? Oh, they tell me what's going to happen in the future. Is that the idea that we have about the prophets? That's not the true idea of the prophets, right? The prophets do 3 things. They talk about the past. They remind people of the covenant that they have with God. They talk about the present of the day that they are in. And they explain, they share with people what is the state of affairs that you guys are in right now. And then they also talk about the future. They do. They talk about what God is going to do. And primarily, the prophets talk about judgment and redemption. And there's a whole bunch of things. They talk about judgment of the nations. They talk about judgment of Israel. Then they talk about redemption of Israel. And they talk about the redemption of all of the earth. Right? And I'm saying this because that's the genre that Micah is from. right? And so when we read it, we get a sense of which part of the Bible it is in and what is the genre trying to say to us. A very interesting exercise you could do is to look at how the prophets coincide with the history books. Sorry, I'm a little bit of a, uh, I love doing that stuff. And the first verse in Micah says that he actually was doing his work alongside three kings. The king Jotham, who was the middle one, the not so great one. Who was the one before him? Sorry, Jotham was fine. Ahaz was the middle one, and there was Hezekiah, right? And actually, Jotham and Hezekiah were good kings. Ahaz was a terrible king, right? And which they were kings of? Anyone wants to say? They were kings of? Good. I love the fact that we are like little confused about Israel and Judah, Israel, Judah, Israel, Judah. That's one very important part of history. When Solomon's son Rehoboam did some nonsense, God split the kingdom into two parts. Okay, there was a northern kingdom and there was a southern kingdom. The northern kingdom is what was called Israel, and the southern kingdom is what was called Judah. And the capital of Israel was Samaria. And the Jews, if you remember, didn't like, you remember the New Testament, the Jews didn't like. You know why? Because they had a syncretistic religion. They basically didn't believe 100% in what the books of the Bible, what the Torah said, the Pentateuch said. But they had a syncretistic religion because the guy who became their king, Jeroboam at that time, didn't want people to go to Jerusalem to worship Yahweh, who had his temple there. He said, if you do that, all you people will start having allegiance back to Judah again. So just to make sure that you stay true to this northern kingdom, I will make another one. I'll make some other shrine where you can go and worship, right? And that's the history of how these two nations became separate, and these two nations used to fight each other. And here's the context in which Micah was talking. Micah is talking about there are two or three major events that take place in his time. The first is that the kings of Samaria, I forgot the name of the king, colluded or became friends with the country of Syria because they were afraid of the Assyrians. All right? The Assyrians were going to come and invade them. So they were afraid of that, and so they kind of became a gang together, and they went to Ahaz, who was at that time the king of Judah, and said, can we all come together so that, we can ward off these Assyrians? And then Ahaz said, no, I'm good. Like, I won't. So they got really angry, and then they went and pillaged Judah. So that's the first thing that happened while Micah was talking about. The second thing that happened while he was talking was that the Assyrians actually attacked Samaria and Syria, and Israel was no more. Israel ceased to exist. If you want to know more, please read the history books. It explains to you how that happens, right? And when Micah starts talking, he's actually telling them, if you look at the first chapter, you will see he's saying, look at Samaria. Samaria is going to be a heap of rubble. And he's talking about the northern kingdom of Israel. He's actually in the southern kingdom, which is Judah. He's talking about the northern kingdom, and he said, Israel, Samaria is going to become a heap of rubble. He started saying all of this in around the years 734 BC. Yes, that is 730 years before Christ was born. And about 14 years after he said Samaria was going to be a heap of rubble, Samaria became a heap of rubble. Right? 14 or 17 years afterwards. And then he's telling the people of Judah, look at what happened to them. And if you don't do what is right, the same thing is going to happen to you. So pay attention. Now, the interesting thing is, at that time was a good king, Hezekiah, and another two prophets who were also prophesying at the same time, which is all this I find really cool. There was Isaiah and there was Hosea, right? And if you read the book of 2 Kings, you will find that Isaiah and the king Hezekiah have this interaction where the Assyrians, after destroying Israel completely, now come to Judah. Because Hezekiah said, okay, we were friends at one point of time, but I'm not going to give you any tribute anymore. So they say, okay, we'll teach you a lesson. And they come at the gates of Judah to make Judah exactly the way they made Samaria. And then that's when God intervenes. Please read it. It's in two places. It's in the book of Isaiah and it's in the book of 2 Kings. The same story, exactly word for word, is repeated in both those places, where it says, God rescued them. God rescued them. But they did end up finally ceasing. They did end up getting destroyed. That was about 100 years later. All right, so everything that Micah is saying about Judah did happen, almost happened during his time, but happened actually about 100 years, in about 100 years later, right? Just a context for us to understand Micah before I get into the actual passage. What is God trying to say in Micah? If you actually read the book, you will find that it has two sections, the first 5 chapters and then the last 2 chapters, right? It's like a repeated cycle. And each of these sections has 2 parts. It talks about God's judgment and it talks about his redemption. And then again, the same thing happens in chapters 6 and 7. It talks about God's judgment and then it talks about his redemption. In fact, if a secular writer, which of course a lot of them do, when they look at the book of Micah, they actually think it is written by 2 different people. You know why they think that? Because some of the most potent descriptions of God's wrath are side by side with one of the most tender promises of mercy and grace. Just read it. You will look at it. In many ways, and the writers say this makes no sense. It doesn't even flow in any kind of logical sequence. But it tells us something about the God that we worship. The reason why they believe it's 2 different people, because it's impossible for one God to be so full of wrath and judgment towards sinful Israel, and at the same time promising those same sinners his sweeping visions of mercy, protection, deliverance. That's Micah. And even as we have been going through Micah, we've actually not gone through it chapter-wise. We've not done chapter 1, 2, 3, because it's very difficult to do it like that. It's all mixed up. And so we've done it thematically. Stephen talked about how God's people need to be careful and listen and change their ways, turn around. Steve spoke about how God hates injustice and he's biased towards the oppressed. And he wants us to reflect that character. And Jason reminded us that just because we are God's people doesn't mean that we are exempt from his judgment. If you look at some of the judgment that God has put together, there's a list of things that God is actually saying in Micah, and I don't know if you guys have it, so you can put up that first one. It's basically talking about he doesn't like the fact that they are stealing land from middle-class citizens, stealing clothes of the backs of people as if they were enemies, evicting women and children, widows and orphans, preaching self-indulgence, with wine and beer, and eating people, stripping them off of everything. That's a list that is there in chapters 2 and a little bit of chapter 3. Right? And basically that paints a picture of social injustice which God hates. And Steve reminded us that. But when we go to the next part, we see that he's talking about God's own people and God's prophets and leaders, people like me. He's saying, you guys, you're guilty of bribery. You're guilty of being priests who are for hire. You're guilty of making prophecies for payment. You're guilty of doing fortune telling in a way that people like to hear. You're guilty of denying reality. Right? Now, in the conversation that we had when we talked about what Steve was telling us, we realized that there is power dynamics. Power dynamics is a huge thing when it comes to any kind of, when it comes to justice and injustice issues. There are people who have power, and then there is everybody else. And everybody else usually is under the influence of those who have power. And God is repeatedly warning all those who have power, saying, be careful that you take care of these people that are under you. Don't mislead them, and don't use them for your own benefits. Now, that, of course, also was in the context of a civil society where he was talking about the Israel with judges and kings and all of that. But when he's talking about the second part, he's talking to the priests and the prophets, right? The ones who are supposed to, the spiritual leaders of the community, and where and how they're supposed to keep people. Their job is to keep people on the straight and narrow. Their job is to make people love God, keep that relationship going. But instead, there's two kinds of failures that happen. There's all of these people, they fail personally. And when they fail personally, there's also a systemic failure that ends up in the whole system gets corrupted. Why do we fail personally? And this is for all of us, because at Wellspring, and in fact, in reality, all of us are leaders. All of us have influence. All of us have spiritual authority over somebody. So listen carefully. You are meant to serve and speak the truth and keep people on the straight and narrow. But you know what happens when you serve? You discover you have influence. You discover that people listen to you. You discover that when you say something, it's taken very seriously. And what happens? It corrupts you. People like strong leaders who tell them what to do. Don't we all know that? And strong leaders like to be strong and tell the people what to do. And this spiritual authority and influence that comes creates personal opportunity. Right? I get to see what I can gain personally out of this situation because of all this influence I now have. Internal questions, that's the internal failure, right? When that happens, question for us. If any of us have spiritual authority, and almost all of us do, what personal opportunity does that spiritual authority create for me? It doesn't have to be something deep, dark, and sinister like I wanna, steal money or get people to pay me, even though that happens. But it could be simple. It could be just, I just like this whole idea of having power of somebody, and the personal opportunity is to just dictate what people do, and that makes me feel happy. It could be as simple as that. Are we aware of that? And do we shun that? Because God hates that. Just a moment for you to think. I'll talk about the systemic failure in a bit. But okay, let me just give you an overview. You know that churches depend financially on the giving of the people who come here, and in any church, most churches. And you know what happens? If you keep the people happy, the people will come to church. If the people come to church, they will give. If they give, we will be sustained. And therefore, there's a great temptation for leaders of churches to keep people happy. All right? The other side of it, as people who come to church, what are we expecting? we are expecting to feel good. We expect for people to tell us what we want to hear. All right? And I'm saying that not just that I'm saying that. It's true of me many times. I don't like to hear difficult messages from pulpits. And that's what Paul is telling Timothy. He's basically saying, be careful that people gather around them preachers who tell them what they want to hear. And that's an entire system failure. Right? When the preachers say that, what people want to hear, and the people come for that, because it keeps this establishment going. It keeps this establishment growing, right? And that is something that we have to be careful about, even for our church at Wellspring. How do we ensure that the establishment doesn't depend on this unholy collusion, as somebody spoke about it during our home groups, but it's based around what God wants us to say? And what I've described is essentially idolatry. What is idolatry? Idolatry is when you come and instead of focusing primarily on God, your focus shifts from God to yourself. It shifts from God to the things that you want. And therefore, you put idols up there that you worship. You know, the worst form of idolatry is when you actually use God's name. You use God's name, but you use it for yourself instead of for His kingdom. Have you seen that? Have you noticed that? It does happen. It happens a lot. It happens too much. Just happens too much. Chris Wright mentioned 3 kinds of idols. And that was in Lausanne 2010. I'll share that talk with all of you guys. And you should read it. You should listen to it. It's amazing. Still remembered by people. He talks about 3 kinds of idols. Idol number 1, power and pride. Idol number 2, popularity and success. And idol number 3, wealth and greed. 3 idols. I've already spoken about power, right? Let's talk about power and pride. Let me say something about pride. You know, I know many of us love this family. I love this family. I love our church. In our enthusiasm, do we sometimes tend to praise ourselves a lot? Do we say this is the best community ever? Do we say that we've cracked the code like so many others haven't? Do we say that there's no other place like this? Do we say that there are other churches that have got it wrong and we are right? We need to stop that. You know what we are? Just one small church in the corner of Bangalore. That's what we are. And this is not to say that God hasn't given us a unique calling. He has. He has given us a unique calling. But we are not the solution to the Great Commission. We are one among many. We are part of a bigger family. We are all together in this. We are all worshiping one God. And we are playing our part in that. We are playing our part in that. So be careful about the language that we use for ourselves. We are not higher or better than anybody else, but we are unique. We are unique. We are not higher or better than anyone else. It's good to remain humble. And it's good to not bow down to the idol of pride. Yeah. So we will not kid ourselves into believing, just like the prophets did in Micah 3:11, that God is somehow uniquely with us and it'll all be well, irrespective of whatever we do. He is. He will subject us to judgment like we spoke about last time. Popularity and success, the second list of idols. There are times when I feel like we have less people coming here than we should. Do you feel like that sometimes? Maybe we should talk about Wellspring a little bit more. And I'm talking about me now. This is me. Maybe we should talk about Wellspring a little bit more so others can come here and be blessed. Nice words. That could be a trap. That could also be a popularity and a money trap. You know why? Because more people means more money, doesn't it? That's when the offering starts going up, and you start having influence in the city of Bangalore as a church, because now you're on the map, dude. Right? And every time I start having these thoughts in my heart, I hear God asking the question, more people is fine. What about those who are already here? How well are you taking care of them? And suddenly I realize, oh no, God, please. What we have is great. And if we are faithful with what we have, you will send others who need to be here. Yeah. Now, I just want to clarify here. Okay. If you belong to that camp that says, wow, I just made a case for this church to always remain small, let me warn you not to fall prey to the idol of comfort, because that's the reason why we might want to still remain small. Not for any other great reason. God didn't save us to hide our light. He said, let your light shine. The problem is when the light shines, people get attracted to it, right? And that's meant to happen. And they come seeking. For so many of us, we find that uncomfortable. Because now our nice, comfortable in-group has to make space for other people. So instead of that attitude of how wonderful it would be if all of us, at some level, got involved in being the word that we use all the time, outward facing. Meaning we make sure that we naturally invite more people into our lives, into our groups and our social lives and our homes with a genuine love for them. Not for the sake of Wellspring becoming a big church. The genuine love for people, right? So that's a little bit of a tension I just wanted to share. Let's not think that our measure of success is more people, but let us definitely know that our measure of faithfulness is the love we have for those among us and for those who are not yet among us. Wealth and greed. We spoke about this already, so I won't say too much about it. But just reminding you of that list. Bribery, priests for hire, prophecy for pay, fortune-telling by the prophets, denial of reality. That system breakdown, that collusion between the people and the leaders for mutual benefit, which kicks God out of the center of this church and puts us on top. Beware, money is dangerous. Does this happen today? I did say it does happen. You know, a lot of this list that I mentioned looks like transactions, doesn't it? I give you money, you give me prophecy. You know, I scratch your back, you scratch mine. It all starts well with a focus on God and His truth, but over time it starts getting twisted because of the things that we mentioned earlier. A sinister exchange starts happening between the people and the spiritual leaders. This uses, like I said, the name of God. It's not meant to give glory to Him, though. It starts becoming about us using Him for our personal gain. You know, there's no doubt that God is our loving Father, and He wants the best for us. But you know what He is not? He is not an ATM machine that if you can just press a few buttons, He'll give you out the money that you want. And we need to remember that and keep him in his place. Keep him in his place. Is that a problem at Wellspring? I don't think so. Thankfully not. Is there a danger? It always is. Is there anything, though, that we might want to be careful about? You know, when we say we are inclusive, I just wanted to bring this up. We're talking about all our values. We talked about being inclusive. We talked about being outward-facing. One of the best things that I feel that God has blessed this community with is with being inclusive. It definitely means that we are accepting of everyone and will never turn away anyone who comes to our doors, irrespective of who they are, what they believe, what they have done. We are committed to that and militantly committed to that. It is also true that we will not allow theological arguments to divide us in a way that we become unloving and divisive. Yes, I love those things about us. But let's remember that we are a gospel-centered church. All of this doesn't mean that we are an anything-goes church. We are a gospel-centered church. What does that mean? It basically means that we believe that the primary problem that we all have is sin. That's the S word. We don't like to use it. A lot of churches probably, and maybe sometimes we forget to use that word, bring it up, raise its ugly head in our faces. Sin is a problem. It is the main problem, and we need Jesus. We believe that Jesus has high standards, and if we say that we follow him, we are obligated to follow those standards. But as you notice in the gospel, Jesus says the darndest things. Have you noticed? He says things that are impossible to do. But you know what? He tells us, follow me. Follow me. Be holy, like I am holy. You know, the interesting thing I find about that is when Jesus preached those things, there were people following him in throngs and in thousands, lapping up every word he had to say. Why? Because the things he said, people needed to hear. They were not the most pleasant things all the time, but they were things that people needed to hear. We must never forget that for all our inclusiveness, we are still on that journey to become like Jesus. That's our end goal. We are on that journey to become like Jesus. So you must never compromise on the relief, of course, that the gospel brings, the good news that we have because of this. But let us also not compromise on the offense that the gospel brings. Gospel actually starts by saying, we are not okay. We live in a culture where the cool thing is to say, everyone's okay. And if we start saying that, then we have a problem. What we are really saying, everyone is welcome. And we are saying, everyone is not okay. I am not okay. You are not okay. We all deserve terrible judgment from God because he is holy and we fall short, far short of his standards. But it doesn't end there, right? Because that's not the end of the story. It's only when we start there, though, is when we begin to appreciate what incredible good news the gospel really is. And we need to know that in the past, we need to know that in the present, and we need to know that it's true for the future, that we cannot make it without Jesus. We cannot make it without Jesus because He is the only way that not only do we escape this judgment, but we have this great future that Micah constantly talks about. And that's the sound doctrine that I believe that Paul is asking Timothy to follow. Don't tell everyone you're okay and just fine. In fact, when we come here, we need to have a stretch pulling at us and pulling us in a particular direction that almost makes us feel uncomfortable, because that's what is the best for you and me. But you know what? The great thing about Jesus and the Holy Spirit, they know how much each of us can take. And that's what we must reflect, even as we sharpen one another. And this is the spirit in which I want to invite us all now to enter into communion. We'll just enter into communion. I'm going to just invite the welcome team to share the communion elements with all of us. Just reminding you of the three idols that we have to be careful of. The idol of power and pride. The idol of popularity and success. The idol of wealth and greed. And that is not something that we point fingers at somebody else and say it's their problem. This is an opportunity for me to point fingers at myself and say, it's my problem. At some point, it starts becoming about me and not so much about God. But one of the unique things, like we already mentioned about Micah, is the fact that it seems like it's written by two different people. We heard about the God, we heard about the judgment, but what you're holding in your hands is a measure of God's tenderness. I'm just going to put up that list if you can. How does Micah talk about Jesus? The warrior shepherd who gathers his flock. The judge who turns weapons of death into salvation and growth. The Lord who dignifies the lame and the outcast. The King who will be born in Bethlehem. By the way, it's there. 700 years before Jesus was born, it talks about Jesus is going to be born in Bethlehem. It's not part of my sermon, so I didn't talk about it. He is the God who does not desire sacrifice, but mercy. Steve reminded us that. He is the Lord who saves by faith alone. He is both our judge and our advocate, pleading our case. That is Jesus, hidden right in that little book, in those 7 chapters, if you look for him. The reason that we are saved from God's judgment is because of his blood and his body that he shed. Those elements in our hand remind us that we are not okay, but because of Jesus, we are okay. We are more than okay. That's why you're holding those. That's what it is meant to remind you of. It reminds us of the past, the work that Jesus did on the cross. It brings us in touch with the present, where we have our need of him today, and we are being renewed. It looks forward to the future, the day when we will all celebrate the great meal with Jesus. Can I have my communion as well? Thank you. If you believe this good news, if you have believed this good news, then I invite you to participate in communion along with us. So we can open this and we can have it. As you do, remember what it means, even as the worship team comes up. just a reminder to you that the scriptures, all the books, this entire message is God's love letter to us. And the elements that you just had is the signature of Jesus on God's love letter to us.